Thank you all for coming. We hope you enjoy the food, which will be coming hopefully shortly. We're going to break if it comes at some point, so don't worry about that. Okay, tonight we're going to be starting you guys on a journey. This is a journey to discover your family history. It's a very individualized story that every single person in this room has. This is unique trip for each one of you. And once you start this journey, there is no going back, let me tell you. Okay, the goal of the club is to, more or less, trace your family tree. Yeah, it's pretty simple. Okay, the question now is going to be, why is it significant? Because while we are Jews, while we do have genealogies, everyone else in the world also has genealogies, and everyone else has family trees. So what about our family trees as Jews is unique and special? So in order to answer this question, we have invited Rabbi Moshe Tzvi Weinberg to help us try to figure out this answer. And no further ado, please, Rabbi Weinberg.
The truth is, the poster, when I first saw it go up, I thought it was like wanted for a terrible crime. It looks like one of those wanted posters. But Baruch Hashem, it's good to be here. The truth is, I have no clue why Binyamin thought to invite me to be a part of this club, but I'm excited about it because it's wonderful to see people coming together to explore their Judaism in a different type of way. Now, we spend a lot of time learning Torah. We spend time studying Jewish history in different ways, but to get into the nitty-gritty and to learn the details of our own personal journeys, like Binyamin said, is really an amazing thing. I want to just apologize. I'm going to have to leave early because I give a shiur at 9 o'clock, so I'm going to have to book out a little bit early. But I'm still going to take you up on that promise to teach me how to do this. You know, the Torah tells us in Parshas Hazinu, Zechor Yemos Olam, Binu Shnos Dor V'Dor, She'al Avicha V'Yageidcha Zekenecha V'Yom Rulach. There's a mitzvah in the Torah that no one ever asks you. Does the Torah insist that we study history? The Torah says so. Zechor Yemos Olam. A person has to have a sense of Jewish history. Binu, and a deep understanding of Shnos Dor V'Dor. All the generations of Jewish history. Ask your father, ask your forefathers, V'Yageidcha, Zekenecha, ask the Zekenim. Ask the leaders of the generation, ask your grandparents, V'Yom Rulach, and they'll tell you about it. Because as the Ramban writes in Parshas V'Eschanan, our link to the Torah itself, our link to HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, is through our Masorah. It's through that awesome chain that goes back to Har Sinai. And as the Ramban describes in V'Eschanan Parak Dalet, when the Torah tells us again and again, remember Har Sinai, remember Har Sinai, remember Har Sinai, what exactly we're remembering about Har Sinai? Why are we so obsessed with Har Sinai? And how do we in fact achieve that? To have that clarity, that remembrance of Har Sinai? It's true the Medrash says our neshamos were there, so we were there, we experienced it, but we don't remember it in that way. How do we remember it? The Ramban describes so beautifully, so poetically. How do we remember Har Sinai? We remember it because our parents told us about it, and their parents told them about it. And it takes us directly back to that unbelievable period in Jewish history when we heard HaKadosh Baruch Hu speak to Klal Yisrael, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, where we were in the presence of God. And the Ramban says that chain, as long as we protect and preserve that chain and understand our place within that chain, is the greatest thing that Klal Yisrael has. It's our direct link to God himself. There's a very famous story they tell about Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. Different Gersos, different versions, exactly how the story goes. I'll tell you the way that Rav Moshe Lieber brings it in his Sefer on Kibbutz Avim. Clarify some of the details. But again, the message is the same. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky was once on a plane flying back to America from Eretz Yisrael. And on the plane he was sitting with his son, Rav Avram Kamenetsky, and one of his granddaughters. And who was sitting alongside Rav Yaakov at that time? One of the heads of the Histadrut, the Israeli Labor Federation. And they struck up a conversation. And they were talking about Tanakh. Rav Yaakov used to joke, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky used to joke that he knew Tanakh unlike many other Rosh Yeshiva. He said his parents were regular people. He wasn't from a long rabbinic stock. So he was allowed to learn Tanakh, even though Tanakh by some was very questionable, as if it was, some controversial book. Anyway, they were talking about difficult passages in Tanakh, and this secular Israeli individual, a person of leadership, turned to Rav Yaakov, and he noticed that throughout the flight, Rav Yaakov's son, Rav Yaakov's granddaughter, they kept coming over and they kept asking, can we get you anything? Can we do anything to make the flight more comfortable for you? And finally, this fellow turned to Rav Yaakov and he said, I don't understand. He said, how is it that you have such a deep family bond? How is it that you have such a good relationship with your son, with your granddaughter? He said, I wish I had the same thing. My family doesn't respect me in the same way, despite my position of prominence in Israel. And Rabbi Yaakov said it's very simple. He said to the degree that a person believes in the Torah and understands and appreciates that chain, a person becomes elevated in the eyes of his descendants. Rabbi Yaakov said it's the difference between our Sinai and Darwin. See, if you believe in Darwin, we believe that what? Those who believe in Darwin, those who believe in evolution believe that man came from monkeys. Which means each passing generation, a person becomes more evolved. A person becomes more elevated than the previous generation, which was closer to a monkey. Rabbi Yaakov says those of us who believe in the Torah, those of us who believe in the Masorah and that chain, understand that each earlier generation is a step closer to what? To Har Sinai. And therefore, those who believe in what we believe in, the more we look up to our elders, we look up to our parents, we look up to our grandparents. And like Binyamin said, you're about to begin this journey. You're about to go exploring, to try to understand a little deeper that connection that you have to the chain. You know, each one of us you're going to find amazing things. My wife, her maiden name is Horowitz. She's a direct descendant of the Shlah Kadosh. She's a Levi, a Bas Levi. She married down. I'm just a lowly Yisrael. On my side, I have some yichus from the Yira Kadosh, from Pershischa. And you're going to research, you'll find interesting things, and you're going to be inspired by them. When you start to learn about your lineage, it's going to inspire you. I remember I was reading, a number of years ago already, Mishpacha magazine. It was issue number 173, if you want to check me on this one. But it was talking about, there's an organization in Eretz called Arachim. It does a lot of fascinating kiruv work. And one of the people who runs some of these seminars, Arachim means values, tries to teach secular people some of Torah values that they believe in, that they already believe in, and that they should understand our Torah principles. So anyway, one of the organizers of one of these seminars was being interviewed by Mishpacha magazine, and he said, I'll tell you an amazing thing. I was dealing with this young man who was so disinterested in God. He was such a non-believer. And he says, you know what happened? You know what the turning point for him was in becoming a ma'amin, becoming a believer in HaKadosh Baruch Hu? What was the singular, clear, it was obvious to me that this was the turning point in his beginning to develop a relationship with God, to believe in God, b'chlal, to accept God as a reality. It was when he found out that he was a descendant of the Rebbe Reb Simcha Bunim of Pershischa, Zuchuso Yagen Aleinu. He found out that he was a descendant of some great Hasidic Rebbe. And it inspired him to start learning more and more and more until eventually he followed that chain back till he came to a belief in God. And you're all going to find amazing things. Maybe you won't find that your yichus is very exciting. You'll find that your yichus, you look around, you try to link yourself back to some great Talmud Chacham, some great tzaddik, a righteous woman of renown, and you find that you can't really find anything. So I would encourage you to look at yourself as the beginning of that great chain. Worst comes to worst, you could always see yourself as the beginning of a new chain of prominence. They tell a story that the Maggid of Mezrich, when he was about 5 years old, his home burned down. And his mother was sitting outside. His mother was sitting, crying, looking at the ashes of their home. And as she was sitting there, he came over as a 5-year-old boy and he said, Ima, what are you crying about? The house? We didn't have that much to begin with. She said, that's not what I'm crying about. She said, I had a family tree. I had this beautiful document detailing all of the details of our family, all of our past, our beautiful past. And as a 5-year-old boy, the Maggid of Mezrich, who would become the second leader of the Hasidic world, the Talmud of Baal Shem Tov, he turned to his mother at the age of 5 and said, Mom, you don't have to worry. He said, we'll start a new line for me. And needless to say, anyone who knows about the greatness of the Maggid understands that he was a person who began a new process. But the truth is, as much as I'm encouraging each of us to begin to plant seeds for the future, to be the beginning of someone else's family tree, right? No matter how much you research, and you may find, again, very exciting things or less exciting things, we all have what to be excited about. We all have what to be excited about because every single one of us has very deep roots. There was a philanthropist by the name of George Rohr, lived on the Upper East Side. Once came to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he was talking to the Lubavitcher Rebbe about starting a beginner's minyan at KJ. And he said to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, we want to start a minyan. He was looking for the bracha of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. We want to start a minyan for people who don't have a background. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, I don't understand what you're talking about. He said, people who don't have so much of a background in their Judaism. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, I don't know what you're talking about. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe explained to him, in very clear terms, that there's no such thing as a Jew doesn't have a background. There's no such thing as a Jew doesn't have a background. Every single one of us comes from the Avos, from the Imos. Our greatest relative of all, and I say this not jokingly, I say this very seriously, our greatest relative of all, when you trace back that chain, like I said, you follow the trail that the Ramban tells us to follow in Parshas Vaschanan, you'll trace it back to God himself. And you'll say, well, God is God. He's not our relative. Where's the latest relative, the oldest relative I can find? HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the oldest relative you could find. When the Jews left Mitzrayim, the beginning of Parshas B'Shalach, Vayhi B'Shalach Paras Ha'am, V'lo nacham Elokim derech Eretz Plishtim ki karovhu. Hashem didn't want to take Klal Yisrael by way of Eretz Plishtim. Why? Ki karovhu. So we normally understand ki karovhu was close. It was easy for the Jews to go back to Egypt. They could fall back into their old ways. Say the Bali Atosos, Das Akena Bali Atosos and Chumash, Ki Karov, Klomar, Ha'am Karov Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Klal Yisrael were the Krovim, were the relatives, the dear relatives of Hashem. Shenemer Levnei Yisrael Am Karova. We're the relatives of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have a lot of background, every one of us. And again, the more we start to research that, the more we recognize that Hashem is, so to speak, the bookends of that lineage. We see Hashem as the end, the beginning and the end of that unbelievable, that awesome chain. Again, we'll be very inspired. There was a Ger Tzedek from Vilna. Maybe you've heard his story. Or Avram Pototsky. He was thrown into jail. He was waiting to be executed. And the Vilna Gaon used to come to visit him in jail, to try to inspire him, to try to keep his spirits high. And he saw one time, he was sitting there, he was crying. And he said to him, "Why are you crying? You were so proud to convert." He gave up so much, the whole story. But he gave up so much from the world he was from to become a Jew. And he was sitting there crying as he was waiting to die, Al Kiddush Hashem. And the Vilna Gaon said to him, "You have to be besimcha. You're about to give your life for God. What more? You're going to go straight to heavens. What are you crying about?" And the Ger Tzedek turned to him and he said, "You know why I'm crying? Because as a Ger Tzedek, as a newly converted Jew, I don't have parents." And he said, "Then I don't have children." He said, "I'm all alone." And the Vilna Gaon quoted from a medrash on the pasuk, "Ani Rishon v'ani Achron." Medrash says, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to the world, "Ani Rishon she'en li av." Hashem says, "I don't have a father either." "V'ani Achron she'en li ben." Even though Klal Yisrael banim atem l'Hashem Elokeichem, we are all the children of God. But Hashem says, "I don't have a biological child." So the Vilna Gaon turned to the Ger Tzedek of Vilna and he said, so what is it that the Medrash is telling us? Everyone knows that God doesn't have a father. Everyone knows that God doesn't have a son, except for a lot of Christians. But everyone else knows that God doesn't have a son, a biological, a physical son, in physical form. So what does it mean? Ani Rishon v'ani Achron. Says the Vilna Gaon. You know what the pshat in the Medrash is? L'mi she'ein lo av b'Yisrael. If you don't have a father, realize that I'll be your father. If you don't have a son, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, "Don't worry, I'm 1,000,000 times better than any of the children you have." We have to remind ourselves of the bookends of our yichus. It starts with God and it ends with God, but there's so much to discover in between. And I'll just leave you by challenging each and every one of us to make sure that we understand our role, not just in researching this chain, but in maintaining the chain. The Piazetzner Rebbe writes in his introduction to his famous work, the Chovas HaTalmidim, the student's obligation. He says, of all the things that Avraham, the first Jew, was praised for, what was it? What was it that God was so impressed about Avram with? Mikol tzidkas Avram Avinu hizkir Hashem va'amar alav ki yedativ l'man asher yitzav es banav es beiso achra v'shamru derech Hashem. Avram did a lot of awesome things. He was a wonderful person. And of all the things, the thing that God says, I choose you, Avram. Why? Because you know what it means to inform the next generation, to pass on the lineage. Kol dor v'dor b'Yisrael tabas b'shalshelas hayuchsin shalanuhu. Every single one of us is a link, says the Piazetzner Rebbe, in that amazing chain. Sherosh kshura ba'Avram Avinu. Again, within basar v'dam, within people of flesh and blood, believers in God, it starts with the first believer of God, Avram Avinu, the one who discovered Hashem in a world of avodah zarah. And where does the chain end? V'sofa b'Mashiach tzidkenu sheyava b'mehera b'yameinu. Mekabalu dor amuna. Every generation receives and passes on emuna, Torah, yira, min ador shekadamo, from the generation before it. V'over b'hanas Hashem, v'oved b'hanas Hashem. And you serve Hashem with exact whatever it is you received, and the next generation is going to serve with whatever it is that you pass on. U'mosher l'dor she'achrav, l'man asher yitzav es banav, like it says by Avram, to pass it on to the next generation. Zeh ikar kiyumeinu, says the Piazetzner Rebbe. This is it. The Jewish people live and die, God forbid, by this chain. Va'im b'doreinu zeh, paska chas v'shalom ha'shalshelas. And if God forbid, says the Piazetzner Rebbe, he challenges each and every one of us. Are you going to be strong in being Makayim and maintaining that chain? Or are we, God forbid, going to be guilty of failing to pass on the Torah, l'dor she'acharein? A person has to realize in the time period in which we're living, the end of time, when the Piazetzner Rebbe says the chain starts with Avram and ends with Mashiach, we're holding by the end of the chain. We're literally putting that last little bit to make this magnificent necklace that HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kiviyachol can wear, of all of the generations. And it's our job to just make that little last clasp, to understand our role in the whole thing. Rav Aaron of Karlin, the base Aaron brings in Parshas Nitzavim, a mashal from Shlomo Karliner. He says, imagine there's a king who needs to get something off of a high shelf, and he doesn't have ladders. So what does he do? He piles people one on top of the next person, each one standing on each other's shoulders. Until the guy who's all the way on top, he's the one who retrieves the thing off the top shelf for the king. So you would say, so he's the one who serves the king. He's the one who carried out the king's mission. Says Rav Shlomo Kurliner, anything but that. To say the one who's at the bottom of the chain, the one who's the feet, so to speak, of the chain, to say he's not responsible for serving the king would be a terrible injustice. If he moves out of his place, the whole thing falls apart. We're that last link, we're the feet, so to speak, of this magnificent chain that began with Avram Avinu and has traveled for many, many, many generations. And it's our job just literally to understand our role, and that's exactly what this club is about, to research it, to understand it, to appreciate it, to become a part of it, to live as a part of it. A chain that really starts and ends with God, but on a more practical level starts with Avram Avinu and ends with us, with the coming of Mashiach. So I'll just leave us with the words of Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner in the Pachad. We're right after Purim, we're heading towards Pesach, a time of Geula. Rav Hutner writes an amazing thing. In the Pachad Yitzchak, in Maimar Yud Ches, he asked a very interesting question. Why is it that the source, that a teacher, that a Rebbe, that a teacher has to respect the student, why is the source for that halacha found within the discussion of the battle against the Amalek? Exactly what the source is, we don't have time for it right now, but you'll take my word for it. That the source, Yehi kavod talmidecha chaviv alecha kishalcha, to respect your students, right? Like you respect yourself, that a teacher has an obligation to show honor to a student. Why is that concept brought out in the words of Chazal, in the story of Amalek? And Rav Hutner explains so beautifully. The Torah tells us in Beshalach, Mechama Hashem ba'Amalek midor dor. The battle against Amalek is midor dor in every single generation. Says Rav Hutner, and I quote, Klomar, Milvad Melchama ba'Amalek b'chol dor v'dor mitzad etzem ador b'pnei atzo. In addition to the fact that Amalek, negativity, evil, exists in every generation, and every generation has to confront that evil head on and try to uproot that evil. The main thing that Amalek tries to battle is what? Is to try to cause a separation from one door to the next door. That there shouldn't be a hemshech, a continuation from one generation to the next generation. That there should be this terrible breach in that chain. And the reason that Amalek wants so badly to interrupt, to break the milchama that's midor dor, the battle to maintain the generations, because contained within that great chain, that great link, like we've been describing tonight, is the secret of Geula. So Mirz Hashem, coming on the heels, in the Ikvus of the Mashiach, we're the heels, we're the end of time. Coming on the heels of Purim, as we come to Pesach, a night where children ask their parents, tell us the history of the Jewish people. Tell us how it works, and help us move forward towards that final Geula. Mirz Hashem, you should take this club seriously. You should be inspired by the opportunity that Binyamin and everyone else involved in the board and the people who have made this club possible. Be thankful to IU for allowing such a club to exist and helping to facilitate it, but to really take advantage of it and to understand your role in this great chain. And the Mirz Hashem will be zocha to maintain those links midor dor until we're zocha to see Mashiach b'mher b'yameinu.
Okay, we're going to have a practical workshop now. How to start, first steps, how to start tracing your family tree. It's a big question everyone's here for. We have family tree templates, if you could hand those out now. Everyone should take one. And, okay. So Gary McIntosh, the world-renowned Jewish genealogist, writes in his book, Introduction to Jewish Genealogy, short 50-page introduction, that there are 10 big myths of Jewish genealogy. One of those big myths is that I'm sure everyone here can think of that's possible either for themselves, for somebody else, is that there are no records left. You know, the Holocaust happened, the Germans came, they wiped out all of Poland, Ukraine, the whole Eastern Europe, and they left no records. They wanted to destroy every trace of Judaism that existed, and all Jews. So Gary McIntosh in his book said this is not true. The Germans were fantastic at wiping out Jews, but they were not fantastic at wiping out records. Not only that, the Germans themselves kept some of the best records of genealogy that we have today. And nowadays, these records are becoming more and more available online. Because of the computer revolution of the past 20 years, these records are being scanned, put into microfilms, made available at libraries, universities all over, and online. Okay, over the course of these workshops we're going to have, we're going to hopefully teach you how to access these records and databases. First one we're going to teach you about is Ancestry.com. Anyone here heard of Ancestry?
Yes.
Anyone? Okay, Ancestry is the #1 database for finding records in the United States. For Jewish genealogy, it's not good for records in Europe. Okay, now every one of you, nobody has a computer. Every one of you has a free access account because you're a YU student. Okay? What wasn't me? You can thank YU and how they throw around their money. You basically go into Google, search Yeshiva University Ancestry Library. And then you go on, you click, there's a link under the databases in the YU library. You go on, and you will have full access to be able to search the databases. Okay, that is your first #1 source to go look at when you go home. Okay, what else can we talk about? Ancestry. Okay, other databases include Genie.com, MyHeritage, we said Ancestry, JRI Poland. All these databases we're going to teach you how to use, and you guys are going to trace back as far back as the records allow you to go. Just a proof for the example that the Germans didn't wipe out all the records. It's not called Bena Zmanim. Okay, between Bena Semestrim, whatever you call it, I had a trip to Poland. I had to stop over on my way to Israel, and I stopped off in the town of my great-great-grandmother, in the town of Tarlov, which is currently in Poland, south of Warsaw, where my great-great-grandmother and her family lived for possibly hundreds of years before the war. I went there to go see what was left, you know. Everyone says, oh, there's nothing left, right? It's all gone. So I had a tour guide who took me around, and she took me to the cemetery. There are a number of tombstones left in the cemetery. I have pictures of them. They're not of my family, but there are a number of stones left. There's a monument to the mass grave that was there in the town. We went to the shul. There's a shul which is still there. It's no longer in function, but it's still in the town. And then we went to the government office. There's about 300 people in the town. It's not like a real government. It's kind of like a village or whatever you call it. And we went to the records, and we said, can you find me the records? They said, well, we have all the records going back to around the year 1800. But we don't have them in our office. We ship them off to another place. Now, all those records have been, almost all of them, I can't say all of them, they have indexes. They don't actually have the records yet. They have the indexes. They've been scanned. They're online. You can find them through Jewishgen or JRI Poland. We'll tell you about that. But she said that the records that they have in their offices go from nowadays back to the year 1900. And I gave them a list of my family members who lived in the town if they could look them up. And she looked them up. And I have pictures of them online. She found all these records. I have about 7, 8 records that I found from the family name was Kleinman in the town. And so there's a lot available. And hopefully, over the course of this workshop, we're going to teach you the basics. All right, the first thing we want to teach you is what is Jewishgen. So we have a video, and hopefully it'll teach you a thing or two. All right, enjoy.
I first began in genealogy when I was 18 years old. I came home from college, and I went down to the basement with my father to look at a big old box of letters. I found a letter from Albert Einstein to my grandmother.
My start into Jewish genealogy was all due to my daughter's question to me when she was taking a middle school trip to Ellis Island. And she came to me and she said, Daddy, we're going to go see where the immigrants came in. Did we have any relatives that came in through Ellis Island? And I didn't know.
Jewishgen is a free online resource that allows people to research their Jewish roots, search for relatives, and learn more about their Jewish family history and heritage.
What makes Jewishgen extremely important and extremely powerful is how it brings together people who are researching the same topics, how it makes connections between researchers, makes connections between family members.
Jewishgen is providing a very valuable resource in the social networking aspect in terms of the Family Finder and the Stet links, the discussion forums.
No other site provides that kind of research, advice, and assistance.
My classes are interactive, and the students are able to interact with each other. We enable communication between people. We are the link to Jewish genealogy.
For me, it's a way to get in touch with the family history that I never asked my grandparents about.
This surprises many people, but Jewishgen is a grassroots organization with more than 1,000 volunteers throughout the world. The importance of our volunteers cannot be overstated. They help us in many different areas, from obtaining data in difficult-to-reach archives, from translation, transliteration, technical support, and in other areas as well.
The volunteers are the backbone of Jewishgen.
People living in completely different places. Someone in Uruguay working together with someone in Israel, working together with someone in Canada.
I'll tell you one interesting story about a volunteer. When we were doing the Dachau indexing project, I was working with an individual that was doing a significant amount of indexing. And typically, I would assign somebody 10 sheets, 10 images, 10 pages, and they would do the data entry and they would send it back in maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks. This person was sending them back one a day. So every time I would send them 10 images, they would send it back. Then he finally said to me, you know what, send me an extra 10 so I'll never have to wait for you to send me the next 10. At some point I wrote to him and I said, you know, is there some special interest that you have in this database? And he said, yes, I was there.
The museum first became involved with Jewishgen in 2002 when I met Susan King, who was the visionary founder of Jewishgen. It could no longer succeed as a purely volunteer organization. It had become too complicated that it needed a larger and more professional infrastructure. And so the museum took responsibility for Jewishgen and set a course for Jewishgen.
In 2004, I received an email from a woman living in Belgium whose background was she had spent her entire life without family and had started a number of years earlier to find out exactly who she was. I asked her, I said, what do you know about the uncle? She said, well, his last name was Wolfowitz. So I said, fine, what's his first name? She said, I don't know, but I know he lived in New York City in the 1950s. So I said, what you're trying to do is find a man named Wolfowitz who probably changed his name to Wolf, who lived in New York City in the 1950s. And she said, yes. And incredibly, about 10 months later, we found the daughter of this man. So now she has close to 200 relatives, where 10 years ago, she had 11.
Right before Passover, we received a call from an elderly Holocaust survivor who was seeking the birth date of her late husband, who had recently passed away. They were in the process of putting up a tombstone and desperately wanted to include that information. I was able to determine where her husband had come from, which today is a small town in Ukraine, and I immediately contacted Marshall Katz, who is the director of Jewishgen's Sub-Carpathian Research Group. He was able to contact somebody who actually went down to the town's registrar's office and was able to take a photograph of the birth record and email it to me. As soon as I received it, I of course called the family to let them know the birth date, and it was very meaningful to the family that they can include that information on the tombstone.
We had discovered some prayer books that were to have been buried as in compliance with Jewish law. They had been in a synagogue that closed, and we discovered some that had names and towns where the people were from, pre-Holocaust period, some dating back to the mid-19th century. And we rescued those books and we put the names of the people in the towns on the German discussion group on Jewishgen. And we reunited those prayer books with the children from those families. One of them was a Passover Haggadah, and it was 2 days before Passover. It was very, very moving for me to be able to do that.
It's extremely meaningful to work for Jewishgen. I am constantly inspired by the volunteers who dedicate so much of their time to help us preserve our family history and heritage for future generations. It's very satisfying to be part of something that impacts so many people in a positive way.
The volunteers, I think, get out as much as they give. You know, I often hear from the translation projects of people who have found records of relatives and have realized family connections that they couldn't have otherwise.
This is a way to do something important. This is a way to meet people.
This is almost like a 24/7 job. It's not going to an office. It's not stopping at 5 o'clock and leaving.
A place where people can meet virtually, exchange information, exchange knowledge, and satisfy this very human curiosity about where we come from and who we are.
Hi, my name is Moshe Wasserman. Hi. One of the first workshops we're doing is how to interview relatives for genealogy research. So one of the first things one would want to do is first go to their parents, grandparents, any relative that might have information. So we want to start with parents, just because it's just convenient that you live at home, you talk to them. And just talk about where they come from, and I know like my mom, she lived in Jersey City till she was 12, then moved to Teaneck. My father lived in different places, Brooklyn, Rockaway, then moved to Edison. That just gives you like a picture of like where your family is from, just the past 30, 40 years. And after that, you would want to go to your grandparents and ask them like more detailed questions. So some of the type of questions you want to start asking is, especially if they're born in America, where did they grow up? Where did they go to shul? Like anything you want to ask, and then you could ask to start. You also want to just get their birthdays, any type of date, like whether if like their parents, if they died, marriage, what date they get married, and with that information, you could go on Jewishgen and Ancestry and other websites, and it'll help you find the other records that will connect you to more information. The big thing that I say about genealogy is that it's not just about the names and dates. It's also about the stories and the feeling of connection to your grandparents and where they came from, let's say in Europe or wherever. So you want to start asking them about personal questions, family life questions. Where did you of course where you came from in Europe. Were you close to the rabbi there? What was Pesach like for you? Because it's not just about the dates. You also want to figure, you want to put it all together, the stories and everything. So a bunch of just personal family life questions. Where did you? When did you get married? Where did you get married? Do you have a ksuba? Maybe you could find more information with the people who are signing on the bottom, the Adam. Maybe they were relatives, they were friends. You could ask great uncles and aunts if they have information also. If let's say your grandfather doesn't know so much. I have a friend that his grandfather knows nothing about his family. So what he did was he went to his great uncle. Maybe if you're not close to your great uncle, maybe you get your grandfather to introduce you. Old people are they very much like to talk. Now my grandfather, he comes every Shabbos and Pesach, and he's always just talking. He loves to talk, yap, whatever is nice. But on Pesach, he always talks about, because he was born on the night of the Seder, so he always starts, every Pesach. It's like, oh, I was born at the Seder. Oh, really? Wow, tell me about it. So he says, so every year it's the same thing. His mother was in labor and wanted to Seder, whatever. And then we talk about, where his father came from, and he came from Pinsk, and how many brothers did he have? He had 10 brothers. Oh wow, what else? Oh, there was 9 brothers and 1 sister. The first person that came to America was this brother, and and then just from then on, you just you gain a lot of information. It's good to do on Shabbos, by the Shabbos table. It's a nice thing to talk about. But another thing you could do is actually set up a time with your relative with a camera or with an audio recorder, and just start asking them questions. There's you get this book I'm reading from Generation to Generation by Arthur Kurzweil. He has a long list of different types of questions that are great to ask to get information. Other types of questions, was your family religious? Were they Baal Teshuvas? Did they belong to any Hasidic type of family? Did they relate to any Rebbeim? Because if you know that information, you could connect to other people that are also connected to that famous rabbi. Where did your family go? Where did your family go to shul? My grandfather, he grew up in Detroit, so he went to shul there. So I called up the shul there, and I found out, there were actually more relatives that my grandfather didn't know of because he didn't remember. And I used 411 to kind of stalk them on the internet to find them, and I just called them, and I got more information. You want to ask them, is there a cemetery plot that they own? You could maybe go there, call up the cemetery, ask for where the place is. There's a lot of information on tombstones. I think Benny, you covered that before. You said something about tombstones before, right? A little bit. Okay. Another thing that all families, not all families, but I know my family, that every family has their family artifact. My great-great-grandfather's Yom Kippur Machzer. My grandfather showed me that once, and it has my great-great-grandfather's name signed in, and he used it when he was in Europe. It's just nice to see. And then when I guess also when your grandparents show you these different artifacts, pictures, silver, they might have initials of family members on it, or candlesticks, tefillin, it's very special to someone. And then with that, when they show it to you, they'll definitely open up and talk about whoever that it was owned by. So we own a bunch of we owned a lofter. There was there was actually a set of two, and it was owned by my grandmother, who came from Hanover, Germany, and they happened to leave. They escaped right before the war in 1939. And the story goes that they on the boat, they took the two candlesticks, and they went, and we have them, and it's very, very we treasure it a lot. Yeah. What? Yeah. So other type of records that you want to ask your grandparents about are their birth records, certificates, their parents' death certificates, and on those certificates, you can find a lot of information of their parents' names, dates, and definitely a maiden name if you want to find out. And yeah, you really want to just open up to your grandparents and be pretend be very interested in that. Tell them you really want to know what the family story is, not just names and dates. It's just you want to also I appreciate it more when I hear a story as opposed to Zadie, when were you born? When were you this? Da 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 da. It's much better to hear a story and get a full picture of it. So hopefully with that, you could start interviewing, and good luck.
Our first practical workshop. So there are many sources out there for Jewish genealogy records, etc., but the best place to start to learn your family history is with you. Ask yourself the basic questions. Where was I born, etc., all the basic dates. When were my parents born? When did they get married? Where do they live? All those various questions. And you say, hey, Dad, who's the oldest living relative in our family? And you go ask them all the relevant questions to help you fill out the forms that are in front of you. And then once you have these forms done, then the real work begins, and then we can start delving into the records. But we just want to caution you beforehand, do not get ahead of yourselves. There's a lot of records, because you're going to start looking at the records. Oh my gosh, there's a Kleinman who was born in 1864, and but I have no idea how he's related to me. But it's a cool record, right? It exists. So we want to make sure you have all the steps before you get there, solid, in order, and that you have it all organized. That way you can get into the real stuff. Okay, thank you, Moshe. Shkoyach. Okay. In about the year 175 BCE, Antiochus IV Epiphanes becomes king and marries his older sister Leotis. From then on, it was established in the Greek empires that their forefathers would be referred to as incestors instead of ancestors. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. By knowing who that the heroes and heroines are in Jewish history, that they were not just leaders, that people who lived hundreds of years ago, that from 2,300 years ago, in the time of the Hanukkah story, they weren't just leaders that lived and led the people. They were real people. They had to make a living, they raised a family, they became grandparents, and their children had to do the same thing. They also had to make a living, and they also had to raise a family, and so on and so forth. Generations after generations, down until your parents did the same thing, and they have to work and make a living, and they raise you. So tonight, we will hear from an expert in ancient Jewish history who will enhance our understanding of who our ancestors were. And hopefully the food will be here soon, and we'll work with that accordingly. Rabbi Schiffman.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to see so many people here. I started out tonight at the scholarship reception, went from there to the Dead Sea Scrolls seminar, and I'm here. And everywhere you go, there are students, and it's very nice. So what I thought to do was to give you some kind of an idea. And by the way, I realize that I have as much time as it takes the Chop guys to deliver, so I have to get it into the right time, because you won't be able to wait too long if you're smelling the Chinese food. And I'll admit to you that I haven't eaten dinner. So I want to give you some kind of idea of what the importance of genealogy has been in a lot of contexts. Now the funny part is, I just came back Thursday. I was in Utah, and I arrived at 6:12 in the morning on Friday morning. And of course, everyone knows that the Mormons are big on genealogy. In fact, you can find a handbook online which is on Jewish genealogy put together by a Mormon. And they have this unbelievable interest in this. Of course, you know, for us it caused a little bit of problem because they baptized the dead, including the Jewish dead and including people who died in concentration camps. And we have a kind of a problem with that. But the fact is that they have this unbelievable connection between genealogy and family. And that's one of the points that I think you want to take home from this evening, which is that both in the historical terms and halachic terms that I'm going to speak in, and in the terms that have been spoken of here, certainly since I got here, there's no question that there's an opportunity here to connect family and to maintain the ancient and very important idea of Jewish family, which for many people is being lost around us in the society. People are losing touch with their relatives. Now the funny thing is that we went to a wedding in Pittsburgh of some relatives of ours, and when someone asked us exactly how you related, the truth of the matter is my daughters know. I never get it right, and I can never explain it. But it doesn't make a difference if you are really in contact. On the other hand, it says on Genie that I have 9,000 relatives. And I don't know, you know, from that point of view, all Jews are related. You know the explanation of the Ein La'ish Goel. If a person doesn't have anybody who's a relative to which you can return his property, how is it possible that any Jew would not have a relative? The answer is it must be a ger. And therefore it says, Begezel ger, hakatuv medaber. In other words, every single Jew has many, many relatives. Now, this tendency to understand ourselves that way goes all the way back to Sefer Breshit. Some of these genealogies that people skip over, and I tell you the truth, my other temptation of what to do tonight, maybe I'll come back sometime and do this, was to take a boring genealogy and show you what's in it by tracing it in the rest of Tanakh. So for example, in Breshit, we have the whole genealogy of Adam through Enosh. And what happens then? Azuchal l'kro b'shem Hashem. The pshat looks like he started worshiping God. Chazal understand it to mean it was the beginning of Avodah Zarah. Whatever it is, immediately in Breshit, hey, they start from Noach to the Nephilim. And remember the problem with the Nephilim is that they're having relations between the divine, whatever they are, B'nai Elim. This we skipped when I was a kid. I remember finding out that this existed. I was like in shock. What? It's funny, we skipped it. I didn't know it was there. With the having relations with Benot Adam. But in other words, at that point you start to understand that there's a negative to genealogy sometimes. If the genealogy isn't with the right people in the right way. Then we get in Breshit Yud Aleph, the table of nations, which is very important because for us we understand the world as a bunch of families connected to one another. That's what it means to be the various nations that are in connection with one another. And much of this is in these words, V'zed toldot ha'adam. And toldot for us doesn't just mean the genealogy. But actually, it's interesting, you find later on that toldot comes to mean the nature of people, because you learn something about people from their genealogy. Now, I actually have a list of all the genealogies, and I don't want to read too much of it to you, but I want to point out that if we jump from those in the Torah, we start to see, for example, a genealogy for King David. But the ones I want to talk more about are in Ezra and Nehemiah, but I just want to say first, almost no one's ever studied Divrei Hayamim. One of the reasons that they don't study Divrei Hayamim, the two reasons. One is the first 9 prakim is nothing but genealogy. Name after name after name, including reason number 2 why they don't study. The Radak mentions this in his comment, in his introduction. The fact is that there are all these people you never heard of. What do you mean? This one had another brother. This one had another sister. They had Divrei Hayamim is all kind of new information. But what I want to get across to you is that the Tanakh is loaded with interest in genealogy. But we have to understand that once we get to the period of Bayit Sheni, genealogy is going to take on a new meaning, because the question of who's in and who's out. Before mentioning that, we just should mention that genealogy is very important in Vayikra Yudchet and Kaf. That's the forbidden marriages, forbidden consanguineous marriages, where you can't know who they are unless you know who they are. Someone said something about the Eidim, they may be relatives. Of course, the Eidim can't be relatives. And I had a funny experience at a wedding I was at recently, where somebody discovered that the 2 Eidim to be under the chuppah were actually related to one another. So they disqualified one of the Eidim and sent him away. And they asked the father of their kala who to call up. So he said to call me. Excuse me, I'm your relative. What are you doing? I'm also disqualified, not because I'm a related one. I'm related to the other, to the kala. So anyhow, bottom line is, in consanguineous marriage, the only way we can be certain that we observe consanguineous isurim properly, isurei bia, is if we know who our relatives are. This is so important that it comes up in a halacha, which virtually everyone observes, which has to do with adoption, which is that you can't adopt a child and not tell them. This is a tshuva of Moshe Feinstein, because what happens if they end up marrying their own relatives? So they have to know who they are. If they don't know who they are, God forbid what can happen. And you probably all know the story about the brother and sister who were captive and thrown in during the Roman period, thrown in a prison together, and they couldn't, somehow it was dark, I don't know, I mean, you know, however the story goes, right, it must have been much more horrible, you might say. And then they discover in the morning that they're brother and sister. Now also we have in Tanakh the line of the Kohanim, and all that has to be determined. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. But let me get to something very important. This is in Bayit Sheni. We find immediately when in Sefer Nehemiah they started the temple in 520 BCE. Now Nehemiah is like almost 100 years later. But nonetheless, there's a whole discussion about who are legitimate and who are legitimate Kohanim. And we learn these families, the Hakos, and from the family of Barzillai, and all these different people. And then it says something amazing. Eile bikshu kitavam habit yachsid. They were looking for their pedigree documents, which a Kohen, according to halacha, not to get an aliyah, but to serve in the base of Mikdash, a Kohen has to have it. If you don't have it, you can't serve. And they looked for them. V'lo nimtza, vayigo alu. They were ruled to be unqualified min hakuna. Vayomer atashata, who's understood to be Nehemiah by the Faforsha, but anyhow, whoever he was, lahem. Hashem lo yochlu mikodesh hakodeshim. They can't eat sacrificial meat from the kodesh hakodeshim. Aramora kohen l'urim v'tumim, until there come a kohen in the end of days who will have the urim v'tumim and be able to tell. That's the Mishnah, by the way. The Mishnah says the opposite, actually, that Eliyahu Navi is not going to come, right, to distance people. But in any case, right now, when we hit the time of the Chashmonaim, which was mentioned a minute ago as part of the comic intro, but in the books of the Maccabees, we find out that one of the big issues is that they are going to take the kahuna, but eventually the rule, which normally belongs to Beit David. Well, who's in Beit David? You know, there were people down to the Middle Ages who claim they're in Beit David, and some of them claim it until today. That's all these people who make these claims. But I want to point out to you that there is a section in 1 Maccabees 2. In those days arose Matityahu, the son of John, that means Yochanan, the son of Simeon, a priest of the sons of Yoyariv. That's the name of the priestly group of the Mishmarot HaKuna. There were 24 Mishmarot HaKuna. And then he came from Yerushalayim, he bowed the mountain of Modin, and he had 5 sons. John was surnamed Big Goddess, and Simon was surnamed Thasi. You know, only Judah was called Maccabee. You know that. Anyhow, these Chashmonaim, each one of them is listed there. But actually, they were not of the family that were the Bnei Tzadok, were the ones who ran the Beit HaMikdash. So the point I want to make to you is that what family of Kohanim you are, and your ability to prove that you're a legitimate Kohen or a bit of Levi, all would depend on knowing, basically, your genealogy. If you don't know your genealogy, you can't know that you're a legitimate Jew, and you can't know if you're Kohen or a Levi. Now, another really good example of this, which is always problematical for Jews. I think every Jew knows that there's a big problem with Jesus' claim to be from Beit David, because he claimed that his father is not his father, right? Everybody knows this, okay? But if you open up in the New Testament itself, and you look in Matthew 1 and Luke 3, you will see that they're not the same exactly. There's a whole genealogy which is amazing. Now, just imagine that somebody running around in the Second Temple period, in about, he probably wasn't born in the year 0, so because it's impossible, because it's born while Herod was still king, and that has to be before 4 BCE. But anyhow, he was born, listen to this, Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac father of Jacob, Jacob the son of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez, keeps going like this, Yoshaphat, I'm skipping, the father of Yehoram, they're tracing, by the way, I didn't mention David, he's in there, right? Anyhow, goes on and on, Manasseh the fate of Ammon, eventually down, Azor the father of Tzadok, Tzadok the father of Rakim, Elihu, Elazar son of Matan the son of Jacob. Now look, it may be that this was made up. It may be, in order to claim that he was a legitimate person from the house of David. But this means Jews were running around in Bayit Sheni with this type of genealogical knowledge. Now I also want to point out that what's extremely important in halacha and rabbinic texts are the following. First, the question of who was a legitimate Tana or Amora. Besides having to be Jewish, which is obvious, if you'll notice, they mentioned 2 and 3 generations of who they are. Said so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. So this gets to a number of important things. First of all, Jewish identity. Jewish identity, according to the Mishnah, is determined by the mother, and the status, so what we say is the psulim hochim achar ha'im, that is to say, the woman decides who's in and who's out, and haksherim hochim achar ha'av means whether you're calling Levi Yisrael, which means in this one the women have the most important power, because they decide who's Jewish, and they decide, or their identity terms who's Jewish. Now the point that I want to make is that there was a time when you had to prove you're Jewish in antiquity, and of course this has come back today. If you know nothing about your genealogy, you may be unable to prove you're Jewish. Now, whether halachically one should have to prove that he or she is Jewish or not is another question. But it actually, and I hate to warn some of you who will soon be in this situation, you're going to be asked information to prove that you're Jewish. So these papers he gave out over here may turn out to be rather significant, because today rabbis are asking for proof that you and your parents were all Jewish before they'll do the chuppah. When I got married, no one asked if we were Jewish. They asked if anybody had been married before. Nobody asked if everybody was Jewish. They just assumed it. Okay. Or maybe they figured that nobody but Jews could be mashugah enough to have a kid like me. I don't know. But one way or another, they figured that everyone was Jewish. Now, another very important thing has to do with shtarot, contracts. Here we find genealogy in a different way. We find it running like this. You have somebody who needs to be identified. So of course we all know this Moshe ben Shimon, that's very nice, or Yehudit bat Shimon. We want to know who this person is. What happens if there are 2 Moshe ben Shimons or 2 Yehudit ben Shimon? So we say, right, Moshe ben Shimon ben Shmuel, or make the feminine one, whatever you want. Now, what then happens if that's not enough? Do you go to the 4th generation? Generally the halach is you go to a characteristic. So a characteristic like is from Modi'in, okay, from, Kfar so-and-so. Now, at the same time, there is the opportunity to attach terminology that will explain them. For example, the tall one, the short one. All of these things involve knowing your genealogy. And in fact, if we have to determine who are the legitimate Eidim and who's on this contract, we may have to look at that information. Today, of course, it's somewhat, this particular thing is somewhat easier because, oh no, it's Joe Schmo who lives in such and such place. We have all kind of information and internet and all that. But let me point out also that in Talmudic times, the consanguineous marriage thing was expanded. How it was expanded? By what's called shniyim. Second levels that are aser. We won't go into the details here, but if you ever studied Yevamot, you get some idea of how this works, of who can't marry whom. Now, I've studied Yevamot numerous times, don't understand any of it, because that's the thing that I told you before, that I don't know how my relatives are my relatives. But let me tell you a hysterical story. A guy once came to me, he's in a Daf Yomi Shir in Yevamot, and he said, I can't understand anything you're talking about. And I have this great book. And he shows me a book, he takes out the book, and he says, and the teacher has another book, and he keeps on talking about it. I got it in 1 second. The poor guy didn't realize. The teacher's book started with generation 1, generation 2, generation 3, generations 4. The student's book started with generation 4 on the top and went down to generation 1. And he didn't get that. So he understood nothing the teacher was saying because he had different diagrams than the teacher had. He should have bought the book the teacher had. However, despite all the diagrams, I don't understand any of that stuff. However, right, the fact of the matter is that we continue to see with Chazal the discussion of the legitimacy of Kohanim and Leviim, obviously. Now, another very important matter that's taken up in the Mishnah at some length is the question of children without ID as to maternity, paternity, or both. Now, this is the whole business in the Perek Asara Yochasin, which you should all look at if you're really interested in genealogy, which is the 4th Perek, the last Perek of Mishnah Kiddushin. Asara Yochasin alu bi Bavel. When they came back, there were 10 different types of people. Now, some of these people are regular Jews, Kohani, Levi, Yisraeli, that's easy. Then starts Chalalei. Chalalim are people who had been disqualified because somebody violated the laws of Kedusha of a Kohen. Geirei, converts. Charure, freed slaves. Mamzere, mamzerim. Mamzerim are complete Jews. You don't want to be called up to the Torah. Plodi ben plodi hamamzer. But it's a complete status. A mamzer can get aliyah. And then it goes on and they tell us who can marry whom. Now, actually, these qualifications are not a major problem today. But even though these qualifications are not a major problem, I'm on time, we're in good shape. Even though they're not a major problem today, the reality is that in halacha, the importance of genealogy is there. This is the point I'm trying to make to you. I'm trying to make the point that in classical Jewish history, in classical Jewish texts, in our Masorah, in our tradition, that the genealogy is important. Now, what's really interesting is that when we jump to the Middle Ages, the matter remains complex with issues like contracts, but we start to get some additional things. Example, the question of who is a Jew. Who is a Jew becomes a problem when Jews are spread all over the world, and despite all the talk about it, you sometimes have to prove that the person is a Jew. So this starts also in the Middle Ages. Then we start to get something else in the Middle Ages, traditions of descent from David. We mentioned that before. And there is a book by Arnold Franklin about Jews, who, by the way, is a Yeshiva Flatbush graduate and an Orthodox Jew, is a book on the descendants of David in the Islamic world. This is a phenomenally interesting thing. And of course, the identification of Kohanim and Leviim, even though it doesn't anymore require a Sefer Yochasin, it can happen to become problematical. I'll give you a modern example. Some people we know became religious. Their father heard he was a Levi. He was at the time not religious. He later became religious. Father heard he was a Levi from his father. He didn't even know what it meant. So they went and asked Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and we Leviim, and he said yes. Okay, years later the man died. They went back to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. He'd had Elias as Levi. He became religious. And he got Elias Levi for his whole life. They went back to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and said, can we put on his tombstone that he's a Levi? Now, he must have been saying on the side, like to his wife or whatever, these morons. I told you you have an Elias for his whole life. They're calling to ask me whether they can write a Levi on a tombstone? What kind of silly question? But he just nicely told them, yes, you're right. I told you the first time, he's a Levi. But these issues do come up today. Now I want to tell you a little something about genealogy gone wild. The Karaites have an idea called Rikub. Now, you all know who the Karaites are, right? These are the people who rejected rabbinic tradition. They were quite prominent from the 7th and 8th, from the 8th century on. The Karaites were, contrary to some of the things that you may be told, they were a group of sectarians who coalesced. But the point I want to make about the Karaites is this Rikub thing. Rikub means the expansion, concatenation of, it's the genie on internet, where everybody's a relative to everybody, you can't marry anyone. So let's say that there was a student here who has a brother-in-law whose sister-in-law is married to someone else in this room. Then the brother-in-law of that person's sister-in-law's brother's uncle, who has a child, cannot marry the first person in the chain. Now this is a fiasco. If you're Karaite, you don't have a lot of people. I mean, there are like 30,000 in the world today. I mean, what would they do? So they had to put some kind of a cap on this thing going wild. But the reality is that this was something which expanded and expanded. They had tremendous chumras. I'll just say something very funny. One of the founders of the Reform movement actually wrote a book on Karaism that is actually an excellent book about the problem of Rikub and how it worked. Now, in modern times, we have all new issues of this. And the first issue is the who is a Jew problem, which itself makes up a whole talk. We can't have time. Some of you may know that I wrote a book, Who Was a Jew, about the relevance of this to the Jewish-Christian schism. But the whole question of who is a Jew in modern times. Then we have the issue of genetics and biological heredity. This is an unbelievable subject because of the new laboratory work that's being done and new studies that are being done. Some of it at Einstein, by the way. And what is taking place here is that there is a whole new understanding of the biological nature of the heredity of Jews and how the heredity of Jews from different places has overlapping, we could say isoglosses, if we use non-scientific terminology, with the genetic material of other Jews, even though there's no one label for who is a Jew genetically, and halachically, we could never ever use this, because a person who doesn't match the genetics can be 100% kosher Jew, and a person who does match the genetics could just be a non-Jew from Lebanon who has similar characteristics to the old-fashioned Jews, or a non-Jew from Lebanon who moved to Europe, you know, 1,000 years ago. So we cannot test people to determine if they're Jewish. Then we have what you guys are doing here. And let me start to talk a little bit about this and then come to a close. This is the idea of tracing your heritage as an aspect not only of all this halacha and heritage that we talked about before, but of the modern identity issues. In our world, which has become smaller and smaller, to a way which is really absolutely unbelievable, in that world, ironically, it seems to be necessary for people to understand their identity more and more, especially in populations like ours that are mixed up, where people, their relatives came from a whole lot of different Jewish communities, and those Jewish communities may stretch from, the England to Iran, and these people want to know their identity, and that's why I think many of you will want to increasingly know your identity as you're all being mixed up, socially, familially, etc. So this is what we see with the moving of Jewish communities, and now the availability of archives and communication and internet, that many, many people are tracing their Jewish identity, not for any of the reasons we talked about before, but because they just want to know, you could say, who they are. And this is probably what brought you here, not because you have to prove you're Jewish, and anybody sitting here has got to worry about proving they're Jewish unless you move to Israel. And now, the other related things I want to mention, and then I'm going to tell you a story to end. The other related things are, first of all, last names and modern families. I will disclose to you that my wife, who works in the library in the back, right, in technical services, is actually an expert in Jewish names. So some of you may want, if you want to learn how to find out about names, you can go see her. But I'll just tell you that the whole business of last names and family names is itself a wonderful subject. Hasidic lines has become a very big issue in terms of knowing who's who. And then yichus to important people. And now I'll tell you the final story. The final story goes like this. It's a story that Abraham Fried told at a concert. Abraham Fried was in the Catskills on the way home from somewhere, and he found that the guy pumping gas was a Jew. So in typical Lubavitcher fashion, he asked the guy, he knew he hadn't put on tefillin, if you want to put on tefillin. The guy said yes. So he starts putting tefillin on this guy, who was a gas station attendant. So while he's doing this, some Satmar guys pull up. And they say to him, what are you doing? This guy, he's this, he's that, what are you doing? You're putting on tefillin on him. Who do you think he is? So he told him, you don't know who this guy is. He's actually a great-grandson of the Divrei Chaim Mitzans. Anybody here learn Yoredeya yet? He wrote a very important parish, Divrei Chaim. There's a parish on Yoredeya. Anyhow, so, okay, fine. So they go into the store, whatever, the place, they're buying something. They come out, they're getting ready to leave. Avram Fried knocks on the window, and they roll down the window, and he said, listen, I lied to you before. He's not a descendant of the Divrei Chaim Mitzans. He's a descendant of Avraham Avinu. So that's ultimately the yichus of every Jew. That's ultimately the genealogy of every Jew. And that's what you're doing by discovering your more immediate family roots, if that's what you're going to do, is linking yourself to the whole tradition and Masorah of the Jewish people. So it's a good hobby. Don't let it get in the way of your schoolwork. And I think it's really a great thing that we're starting here, that people are getting interested in this, and there's a chance to learn a tremendous amount about Jewish history and other subjects, related subjects, through doing it. So I'll close here, and thank you very much.
50 seconds of your time. Thank you so much, Rabbi Schiffman, for coming and really enlightening us about genealogy and history. 30 more seconds. Just want to tell you, food's outside, so just hold tight. We want to tell you the next upcoming event is going to feature the Vice President of IAJGS, Nolan Altman, who's going to talk about records, and he's going to talk about specifically, once you have your trees filled out, then you can bring them back next time, and then you can start the heavy-duty work with the records and the records. Everyone, please remember to bring your laptops for those events. Thank you very much for coming. Everyone have a great night.